I was assigned to Weston State Mental Hospital in Weston, West Virginia, for my clinical rotation in seminary. The only communication I got with the hospital prior to my arrival was the reporting date and the fact that my accommodations would be waiting for me in the hospital. There was no address, no directions, so I assumed that it would be self-evident that once I got to town, I could find the hospital. I was wrong. I drove around for a half hour and could not locate the hospital anywhere. I swallowed my manly pride and stopped at a local convenience store to ask for directions. While the General Lee was not in the parking lot, Bo and Luke Duke were definitely behind the counter. I explained my problem and asked for help. They looked at each other knowingly and grinned. I knew I was in trouble at that point. And sure enough, they gave me the most obtuse directions I've ever received in my life, referring to places that used to be and stumps here and the big oak tree there and a piece here and over there. It didn't take me long to realize they were leading me deeper and deeper away from town and into the heart of the country. I listened politely, and when they had finished their narrative, I thanked them and headed to the door, only to hear behind me, "Damn Ferner." And I most certainly was a foreigner in that land. It was a place I had never been to, in a world that was very unlike the one I had been accustomed to. And that wasn't even taking into account being in a mental hospital. Over the course of the months, I learned to love and to appreciate wild and wonderful West Virginia. But I knew, regardless of whatever happened, I would always be a foreigner. I never dreamed, however, that I would be a foreigner in this place. And yet, the last few months, that's exactly how I felt. Like I've woken up from a bad dream in a land that is so unfamiliar, that is so unlike what once was. It's a weary and strange place. Well, the buildings are the same, the faces are the same, but nothing else remains the same. We don't relate to each other the same way. We don't talk the same language. We don't do business like we used to. We don't engage one another in the ways we used to. There's a guardedness. There is a fear. There is an anger. There is an anxiety that permeates everything. Never in my life have I had to so guard every single word that comes out of my mouth, lest it be construed or perceived as being some kind of a political or social commentary. I have found it fascinating that I have been branded as both a leftist and a fascist. I'm not sure how one does that, but I seem to have done it. I guess it's a unique talent. My words have been used to support one side of the aisle and the other at the same time. I guess I just am a creative genius. But it has left me feeling very much a damn foreigner. I've shared often in our conversations together over these months the similarities between what we're experiencing in these days and that of the exile. For God's people, when they found themselves in exile in Babylon, found themselves in a foreign land, a land with new customs, new ways of doing things. And creatively, they adapted to that new world. doing some of the most creative theological work that God's people had done in centuries. It was during this time that they collected and edited much of what becomes the Hebrew Scriptures. It is here where they learn to retell the stories and to seek new ways of being God's people in a foreign land. Unfortunately, I don't see any of that kind of creative work happening in our world today. Oh, that we would. What I do hear a lot of is a yearning for the way things were back in the good old days, like 2019. And a prayer that we can soon return home. This was also very prevalent in the time of exile. We hear it in the words of the prophets, words of hope and conciliatory dreaming, words of yearning, images of new life and new ventures, images of returning home. One of the great images to appear out of the rhetoric of the prophetic word in those days was the emergence of the term Messiah, deliverer. One like Moses, who would come and deliver his people and return them to the homeland, return them to the way it once was in the good old days. A word of caution about Messiah. Sometimes we get what we look for. Those in exile got their Messiah. It was Cyrus, king of Persia. He came, beat up on the Babylonians, opened the gates, and said, "You can now go home." Very few went, and those that did discovered not a land flowing of milk and honey, not even a land they remembered they left, but a new and strange land, a desolate and weary and worn land, a broken land, devastated, a land where people were greatly divided. This marks a shifting then in their theology and in their writing. And this is reflected in the last third of the Hebrew Scriptures, what the Jews called the Ketuvim, the writings. The move is away from this kind of pie-in-the-sky, hopeful, optimistic view of the future, and into a roll up your sleeves, get down to work. God in the midst kind of theology. It is an understanding of God not in some remote place, pulling strings, needing to be appeased, but a God who has thrown his lot in with the likes of us. In the midst of this time of rebuilding, restoration, and reconciliation. The writings reflect a day-to-day kind of relationship with God. A God who hikes his skirts up and rolls up his sleeves and enters into the muck and mire of our human existence. And we as Christians understand the fullness of that in the form of Jesus the Christ, who on the night in which he was betrayed, picked up a towel and a basin of water and washed his disciples' feet, giving them a new commandment to love one another as he had shown them the way. Regardless of what happens in the months ahead, There is much work that will be needed to be done. There will be rebuilding, restoration, repair, and reconciliation in the midst of this weary and broken land. God is already well underway, and we would do well to join him in his efforts, to begin to do the work where and how we can, to do some of that creative thinking about what does it mean for us to live together in this place, and how can we do it in a faithful and loving way. We won't do it alone. But one of the other promises that comes out of the exile is that God will not leave us orphaned, but that in Christ, he is in, with, and through all that we do, even in this weary land. Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a weary land. A weary land, my Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm. No one can do like Jesus, not a mumbling word he said. He went walking down to Lazarus' grave, and he raised him from the dead. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a weary land, a weary land. My Jesus is a rock in a weary land, his shelter in the time of storm. When Jesus was on earth, the flesh was very weak. He took a towel and girded himself, and he washed his disciples' feet. Oh, Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a weary land, a weary land. My Jesus is a rock in a weary land, a shelter in the time of storm.